Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, even to me Daniel, after that which appeared to me at first. I saw the vision. Now it was so, that when I saw I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, I saw in the vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. The 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. No animal could stand before him. There wasn't any who could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and magnified himself. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west over the surface of the whole earth and didn't touch the ground. The goat had a notable horn between his eyes. He came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I saw standing before the river, and ran on him in the fury of his power. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was moved with anger against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him to the ground and trampled on him. There was no one who could deliver the ram out of his hand. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly. When he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 notable horns toward the 4 winds of the sky. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the army of the sky, and it cast down some of the army and of the stars to the ground, and trampled on them. Yes, it magnified itself even to the prince of the army, and it took away from him the continual burnt offering, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. The army was given over to it together with the continual burnt offering through disobedience. It cast down truth to the ground, and it did its pleasure and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who spoke, "How long will the vision about the continual burnt offering and the disobedience that makes desolate, to give both the sanctuary and the army to be trodden underfoot, be?" He said to me, "To 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be cleansed." When even I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Then behold, there stood before me something like the appearance of a man. I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, which called and said, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, son of man, for the vision belongs to the time of the end." Now as he was speaking with me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. He said, "Behold, I will make you know what will be in the latter time of the indignation, for it belongs to the appointed time of the end. The ram which you saw, that had the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. The rough male goat is the king of Greece. The great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. As for that which was broken, in the place where 4 stood up, 4 kingdoms will stand up out of the nation, but not with the same power. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have come to the full, a king of fierce face and understanding dark sentences will stand up. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. He will destroy awesomely and will prosper in what he does. He will destroy the mighty ones and the holy people. Through his policy he will cause deceit to prosper in his land. He will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many in their security. He will also stand up against the prince of princes, but he will be broken without hand. The vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it belongs to many days to come. I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for some days. Then I rose up and did the king's business. I wondered at the vision, but no one understood it. Well, Daniel might not have understood it at the time, and he was sick from thinking about it, even fainted. but we understand it completely now. Isn't that the benefit of hindsight, looking back and seeing what God said and how he did it? Some people, they say, the prophecies of Daniel, Daniel couldn't have written them because they're so accurate. They had to have been written after. And so there's this remarkable vision here of Daniel, and I'm going to explain it all, but it's actually not possible for Daniel to have written this after, because we believe Daniel lived roughly around about the time of, 500s BC, between 5 and 600 was his period of life. This whole entire book was translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC, between 200 and 300 BC, but some of the events of this prophecy didn't happen until between 1 and 200 BC. So, even those people, a lot of them liberal scholars, who try to say that Daniel didn't write the book, the translation of this book from Aramaic and Hebrew into Greek happened 100 years before some of this stuff took place. In other words, the prophecy of this chapter and the next chapter are so remarkable. It's if you look at them with an unbiased heart, the only thing you can acknowledge is that, how did Daniel know? Well, the Lord knew. That's how. And if you don't want to follow the Lord and you're trying to find some way to avoid him, you're going to have to come up with a story to explain this type of thing. So he has this vision, and he sees this ram that's got 2 horns. Now, one horn is a little bit bigger than the other, like my middle finger's a little bit bigger than my index. That's because this ram was the Persian and the Median Empire. It's one empire, but it had 2 halves that were working together, the Medes and the Persians. But the Persians were stronger than the Medes, so that's why their horn was a bigger horn. Sometimes you see a cow and it's got, maybe a moose or a reindeer, something. Sometimes the horns are not even, so there's one side is bigger than the other. Well, in the Bible, a horn is always a symbol of strength, or it's a symbol of a king, or it's a symbol of a kingdom. So here we've got this kingdom that's got 2 parts, but one part was stronger than the other. So in the vision, Daniel sees this ram with 2 horns, but one's bigger. But then this goat comes out of nowhere with one big horn, charges at the ram, and takes the ram out. Now this goat with the one big horn, it tells us right here, further down, it says in verse 21, the rough male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. That could not be any plainer that is Alexander the Great. It's as obvious as you can get. And then it says that his horn was broken and 4 other horns came up. Well, that is exactly what happened to Alexander the Great. He died. He was actually sick. Alexander the Great wanted to keep on fighting. He was a funny young fellow. The great courses have a whole 48 lectures on Alexander the Great, which is super fascinating. I listened to all 48. This was some time ago. And it got to the point where they'd been at war for 10 years, conquering place after place after place, and his whole army had had enough. They wanted to go home, but he wanted to keep on fighting. But eventually they convinced him that, and they were going home. But on his way home, he got sick and died. And then the empire... The Bible has put it really simply here. It says out of that one horn came 4 kingdoms, but that process actually took about 10 years. It wasn't like this instant thing, because he didn't have any obvious successor. He actually had children, but they were babies, and it wasn't simple. And I'm pretty sure his male heir, who was back in Macedonia, might even have been killed from memory. A lot of political skullduggery and stuff went on, but he ended up with these 4 generals, which I think was Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. These 4 were after this 10-year process, ended up being the 4 generals that had basically his kingdom divided into quarters. Ptolemy was the one that took the whole southern chunk near Egypt, and that's, like Cleopatra, the famous Queen Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. Well, she's actually not even an Egyptian pharaoh. She's actually Greek. Now, so yeah, she's Egyptian in the sense that she was the queen of Egypt, but no, she's the descendant of this Ptolemy. that was one of Alexander the Great's 4 generals. So, one of the Ptolemies, they got Egypt. The Seleucids, they got the whole Syrian side, and that included, not initially, but included eventually Jerusalem. So we've got this vision here, the goat comes along, its horn snapped off, 4 kingdoms, and it says out of one of those kingdoms, it says the one to the south and the east would come a little horn. Now, that little horn is a king called Antiochus IV, or if you read the book of Maccabees, which is... So there are, we've got this 400-year gap in our Bible. The Bible finishes, the Old Testament finishes at Malachi, and then the book of Matthew starts 400 years later. There are these other books which Catholics and Orthodox Christians believe are a part of the Bible, but which Protestants believe are not a part of the Bible. Those other books fit that 400-year gap, and there's 3 books, 1, 2, and 3 Maccabees. Well, some of these books tell the story, the history of the things that happened with these kings. So in 1 Maccabees, we've got the story of Antiochus IV, or in Maccabees, they call him Antiochus Epiphanes. And this is the little horn, and this is, once you know your history, it's very, very obvious that it's this guy. So in this vision, this guy stops the sacrifice of the temple. Well, that's what Antiochus Epiphanes did. He went into the temple of Jerusalem, and he decided... Basically you can read the book of Maccabees, but he basically decided, you know what? These guys don't need to be Jewish anymore. They need to be Greek. we want all these people to be Hellenized. That's the term for to adopt the Greek culture. And they decided, circumcision's over. We're going to install a gymnasium in Jerusalem. You got to go down for your public bath. And they started trying to enforce the Greek culture. And as part of that, they actually they closed the temple to the Jewish sacrifice. But Antiochus Epiphanes, sometime later, he decided, actually, let's use this temple to offer sacrifices to a Greek god, Zeus. And now this whole Hellenizing thing really got the Jews all cranky and annoyed. And so after a period of time, there was a family, the Maccabee, the family, their last name wasn't Maccabees, it was Hashmon or something like that. But they ended up rising up, starting an army. There was the Maccabean revolt. They conquered the land back, and they reopened the temple, and they started the sacrifices again. And that was called, that was the period that is celebrated today as Hanukkah. So you might have heard of Hanukkah, a thing that Jews do every year around about the same time as Christmas. Hanukkah is the actual celebration of the events where the temple was reopened after this period where it had been shut. And they had to cleanse the temple because it had been used to worship Greek gods. They had to cleanse it and dedicate it back to the Lord to reuse it for his purposes. Well, in this vision, it says that it says, this is verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said, how long will the vision be about the burnt offering and the disobedience that makes desolate, and to give the sanctuary and army time? And the voice said, 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be cleansed. So there's this question, how long are we going to be without a sacrifice? How long is the temple going to be desolate, and how long is it going to be no burnt offerings? The response is 2,300 evenings and mornings. Well, that there is there's a very interesting stuff connected with this number. I'll tell you the bare facts first. People have tried to work out exactly how long was it from when Antiochus Epiphanes shut the temple to sacrifice until Judas Maccabeus, the general in the Maccabean revolt, until he came along and reset the temple back up. And they were only able to work out 1,150 days. Between 3 and 4 years. That doesn't sound right, because it seems to say 2,300 evenings and mornings. But no, what's actually going on there is from the time that they started sacrificing to Zeus until the time that it got rededicated back to the Lord, that was 1,150 days. But actually, there was a whole chunk of time before that the temple was closed and just not being used. So from the time that Antiochus, this terrible guy, the little horn, from the time he shut the temple until the time it was reopened again was... Now, I'm going to say it was 2,300 days. The Associates for Biblical Research have done their best mathematics, and there's a whole article on their website which you can find at biblearchaeology.org. You can go there and search for it. They have worked out mathematically that there was actually 2,264 days between those two events. In other words, there were 36 days short. Some people have said, aha, the Bible's wrong. All right, 2,300 days, and the actual period is apparently 2,264 days. Pretty good, I would say, considering this is written like hundreds of years earlier. Okay, there's two thoughts on this. One, either it's just a rounded up number, which, why wouldn't it be a rounded up number? But the other thought is, maybe their maths is wrong. Maybe it was exactly 2,300 days, because after all, they're doing their maths thousands of years later with limited information. Maybe we don't have perfect information to work out the maths. Either way, the Lord has clearly said what's going to happen. He said let's just add in one word, about. How long will this be? About 2,300 evenings and mornings. Bingo. 2,264 days. Not bad if you ask me. Now, sadly to say, and without throwing stones and being mean to any of our dear Seventh-day Adventist listeners, but back in the 1800s, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was new. There was a group of Seventh-day Adventists called the Millerites. They interpreted this chapter in a really unusual way. Where it says 2,300 evenings and mornings, they thought that this had to mean 2,300 years. For some reason, they worked out in their interpretation, 180 years ago, that this was 2,300 years. They did their maths and worked out that in 1844, Jesus must be going to come back. A whole heap of them sold their houses and their land, and they were waiting on the hills for the return of the Lord, and of course he didn't come. That event has been called the Great Disappointment. It would be disappointing. I don't think you can set dates and times for the return of the Lord and ever be successful. First of all, the Lord said no one knows the day or the hour, so don't try to do it. If you ever have a thought that a certain date must be when the Lord's going to come, you're wrong. Because either you're wrong or Jesus is wrong. And Jesus isn't wrong, so you're wrong, if that makes sense. So I think the Seventh-day Adventists, I've got some Seventh-day Adventist friends, and they're genuinely wonderful Christian people. But I think we've all learned our lesson, and we don't set dates. And so I think that's something we can learn from this chapter. Now, there's two things I really want to say before we round this chapter out. One's a historically interesting thing, and another is something that you really need to understand to help you when it comes to the book of Revelation much later. So here's a historical thing. This is a prophecy that's about this ram and this goat, which was the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire, but they didn't exist yet. Now remember, when Daniel's having this, it says in the start of this vision that it was in the reign of Belshazzar. So it's still during the Babylonian period, but he's seeing a Persian kingdom that didn't exist yet be attacked by a Greek kingdom that was even further on than that. Well, do you think Jewish people read these parts of the Bible and knew about it? Of course. So the Jewish people knew about this prophecy. When the Persian Empire came along, they read the Bible and said, the Persians are going to be attacked by the Greeks. They knew it was going to happen because of this prophecy. So when Alexander the Great started conquering the world, a few really cluey individuals said, he's the goat with the big horn. And one of the people that knew this was the high priest in Jerusalem. Now we know this information because we get this from the historian Josephus. And that's another reason to prove that Daniel was exactly who he says he was, because it's written down by Josephus. You've got people at the time who knew the history and they're writing it down, and it's only scholars like thousands of years later that said, Daniel couldn't possibly have done that. It's because they doubt that the Lord can know the future. That's basically their problem. And so the high priest, when Alexander the Great was conquering, he was getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. And so he actually defeated King Darius, the Persians, in the Battle of Issus. He hadn't quite finished off the Persians, but instead of going to finish them off, he headed south towards Jerusalem. And he got to the city of Tyre further north. He spent 6 months there, wiped out the city of Tyre, and then he headed to Jerusalem. Now, if you were in Jerusalem, you had a choice. Resist or give in. What do you think they did? Well, they didn't do either. They welcomed him. They welcomed Alexander the Great. They actually opened the gates and they went out and welcomed him in because this prophecy showed them that he was coming. Why resist something that God said was going to happen, right? Makes complete sense. Well, the funny thing about it was the night before, this is in Josephus, Alexander the Great has a dream. He has a dream of a man in white welcoming him into the city of Jerusalem. Well, the next day, the high priest comes out, guess what, dressed in white, welcomes him into the city. Alexander the Great goes to the temple of the Lord and offers a sacrifice to the Lord. Man, that moves my heart. That's unbelievable that God set this whole thing up. And as a result of the Jewish people knowing what the Lord said, not a single Jewish person died. Not a single believer in the Lord died because they knew what God was allowing to happen. When we know what God's wanting to do, or when we know what God's doing, it makes a big difference. People live. If you fight the Lord, it causes all sorts of pain. And so, Jerusalem is spared. However, it's like 4 to 5 kings later, you get this nasty Antiochus IV. He's the one that turns around and decides, I'm going to make the Jews be Greek, and causes all the problems for which we have the books of Maccabees. And when we get to the end of the Bible, I'm going to come back and we're going to go through the Apocrypha books, chapter by chapter. So if you wait about a year and a bit, we'll be doing that. So hang in there for that. Now, the last thing I want to mention, which is very, very important. Okay. Verse 17 and verse 26. They both say something very interesting. Verse 17 says this. He came near to where I stood, this is Gabriel, and when he came I was frightened and I fell on my face, but he said to me, understand, son of man, this vision belongs to the times of the end. Times of the end. Now some people, they read this and they think, it's about the end of the world. But it's not about the end of the world. The chapter interprets itself. The angel actually says it's about the Persians and the Greeks. So it's not about the end of the world. So why does it say it's about the times of the end? It's the end of the old covenant. The end of the age when the gospel was only for Jewish people. After that, we have the new covenant when the gospel is now for everybody, which includes Jews. So sometimes in the Bible where it says times of the end, in fact, I'd say just about every time, it's not the end of the world. That's an important point to learn. And in verse 26, it says, the vision of the evenings and mornings, in other words, this vision is true, but seal up this vision, for it belongs to many days to come. Seal up the vision. In other words, put seals on it, on the scroll, seal it up. We're not going to open it up or read about it or think about it for times to come. So how long from the time of Daniel until the time of these events took place? Well, it was a couple of 100 years. The Persians came within a few years of that, but then the Greeks came, 100 plus years later, and then Antiochus came more than 100 years plus later than that again. So this is all happening hundreds of years after. He's told to seal it up, for it's about days to come. Now, some people think, it's sealed. It means it's the end of the world. No, it was sealed up for a few hundred years because those things were to come in the future, in a few hundred years. In the book of Revelation, John has this amazing vision, and he is told, do not seal up this vision, for it's about to happen. What does that tell you? That tells you that the book of Revelation is not about the end of the world either. It's about things that were about to happen then, at the time that John had the vision. Well, you're going to have to hang in for about 9 or 10 months until we get to the book of Revelation, because I'll explain all of that. But the vision of Daniel was sealed up for the future, but we know it happened only a few hundred years in the future. The vision of John was not sealed up because it was about to happen, and it did. It happened within less than 7 years of his vision, and that's why the vision of Daniel was written to 7 churches. Those were the churches at that very time that needed to know that vision. We'll explain it all. Anyway, it's a cool vision, chapter 8, and it's just amazing to me how authentic God's words are when you understand them. It makes us love and value the word of God even more. Lord, I thank you for Daniel chapter 8. Lord, I ask you to bless our hearts as we contemplate your word. May it live for us more and more. And Lord, I pray all the confusion about these things. People think it's about the end of the world, or the confusion about little horns. They think it's the Antichrist. All of this stuff. Lord, I pray you'd remove all of that confusion from us. Lord, give us grace to just understand the clear meaning of Scripture. Amen.